We've all heard the term lifelong learning, but what does it look like in action, and might it be the key to not only your own career, but to preparing your team for the future? I'm Charles Araujo, and this is the TransformIT Show, presented by the Intel IT Center. A short time ago, I went to Indianapolis to talk with Jeff Tonn, CIO of Goodwill Industries of Central Indiana. We discussed why he isn't a rock star, how a deliberate approach to learning has been the key to his career, and why it all starts with a conscious choice. Jeff, welcome to the TransformIT Show.
It's great to be here, Charlie.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm so excited about this conversation because we're going to talk about something that's really near and dear to my heart, and that's this idea of learning, and really specifically kind of lifelong learning. And I know when we were talking, in fact, the whole reason we're sitting here is that we had a couple conversations, and that you just really said that this was something that had played such a central role in your life and your career. And so why don't we start there? Can you just tell us a little bit about your own personal career and life journey?
Sure. So when I was in high school, I was going to be a rock and roll star, man. That was my passion, write music, write lyrics, and so I even went to college to major in music. Found out very, very quickly you had to have talent to do that. So ended up kind of casting about for a few years. About the same time, got married, and so dropped out of school to support my family. A few years later, was really trying to figure out what was next after bouncing around from job to job, and I happened to be working for a local bank, and was actually a bill collector for their credit card systems. And they were starting a new project to develop new software for the credit card collection system. And around that same time also is when the personal computer was coming out. So I ended up getting a Commodore 64. And at that point, I lived about 20 miles north of Indianapolis and rode a bus back and forth every day to work. And it was about an hour and a half bus ride. And I started diving into college textbooks on PL1 programming, system development lifecycle, database design, anything I could get my hands on. That was specific to the bank that I was working on, because my plan was to get over there. But I kept digging and learning coding, and through self-study, but also from learning from people around me. I finally got the opportunity to sit on the other side of that same project team as a coder, but I knew the business because I'd come from there, and surrounded by this team that was very willing to help me learn. It really kind of started that journey of lifelong learning and study and diving in and just wanting to understand how things work.
And it was very focused, right? I mean, I think when we were talking, you talked a little bit about the textbooks and that bus ride, and that you took a very deliberate approach to this.
I did, because I saw this goal of wanting to be in the IT department for the bank. So I was very specific about the type of languages that they needed that they were using, the type of processes that they use. So I was very focused on that. And we talked earlier about the studying of the textbooks. I can remember sitting in my living room at home, and my kids are kind of on the floor playing, and they'd say, "Daddy, what are you reading?" And I'd say, "Well, hop up here and I'll read it to you." And so I was reading structured PL1 programming to a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they still give me stuff about that.
Did you at least make it in the fairy tale format?
No, I didn't.
All right. Well, I think that this is a story that probably resonates with a lot of the viewers, but I think it, as life goes on, it can be really difficult to maintain that balance, to kind of stick at it, right? We all have that first point where we started, but you've done this continuously, and I know we'll get the rest of your story as we talk, but how did you bring this into your life in a way that you were able to kind of stay with it?
Part of it is just the desire to learn, but you're right. You're balancing work, you're balancing life, you're balancing trying to learn the next thing. So as I look back on my career, there'd be times when maybe I wasn't learning anything new, kind of that rest period, right, where you're focused on other things. But then you'd look and say, gosh, in order to achieve that next step, I need to understand that. And whether that's a technical thing or whether that's a leadership, management, business process thing, that became a lot of different things throughout the years, just trying to achieve that next goal, that next step.
So I think one of the things that struck me when I read your blog post and when we were speaking was, again, this deliberate nature, that it was not just, I mean, I think you have a natural desire to learn just based on our conversations, but again, there's been this deliberateness to it. And so I guess one of the questions is, if it doesn't come naturally to somebody, do you think that anyone can embrace this? And if so, how might they go about that?
Well, I think they can. I think part of being a leader today, well, probably any time, is you have to understand your strengths and weaknesses. You know, look at yourself without any of the guises of self-deception, right? And you could take the Drucker approach, which is basically accentuate your positives and the negatives will become irrelevant, right? I think that's true to a certain extent, but the other thing that I've done is I've kind of looked at those weaknesses and said, you know, in order for me to do what I want to do, there's some things in there that I have to attack. A great example was, I would hate doing presentations, even for a project team, people that I knew, much less getting up in front of a crowd of strangers and talking. And it was like, in order to be the leader and the CIO that I want to be, I'm going to have to be able to do that. So I would purposely sign up for networking groups that made you, as part of being a part of the group, get up and talk about yourself, talk about your company. I'd go to networking events. I put myself in situations where I was presenting to Rotary clubs all over central Indiana, and had nothing to do with IT, but everything to do about getting up in front of people. You know, I still get nervous, but now I get energized from the nervousness instead of petrified from the nervousness. So that was one example of taking a weakness and really focusing on it to turn it into a strength.
So I think one of the things that seems to imply is that this really represents a choice, that for each and every one of us, and I really appreciate what you're saying about that we do need to accentuate our positives, but it's also about identifying our weaknesses, at least to the point that they're stopping us or going to impede us from getting where we want to go. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we're in life faced with this opportunity or these choices to be made, and I guess the question is how you respond to that, right? And I think you've experienced some of that.
Yeah. Yes, I think it is a choice. And a great example, a few years ago, we embarked on a series of cloud projects here at Goodwill, and one of the things we did was we went Google. Just a fun fact to know and tell, we actually went live on Super Bowl Sunday when the Super Bowl was here. And that was what the project team decided would be a great day to go live, because who's going to be doing email after the Super Bowl, right? And oh, by the way, although it was a different Manning that beat Brady, it was still great to see a Manning beat Brady in the Super Bowl. So our systems engineer at the time was really heavily involved in the project, but he came to me 2 weeks later and resigned. And his reason was he really saw himself as an exchange guy. That embodied his entire professional career, to develop an exchange and to maintain exchange. And when we went Google, he didn't see himself in the future, right? So contrast that with a few years later, we're continuing down this path, and our next systems engineer that replaced that gentleman, I go to him and say, gosh, we want to do disaster recovery in the cloud. What do you think about that? He's like, that sounds pretty interesting. Let me dig in and learn about it. He ended up architecting the whole thing, running the entire project, and then he says to me, well, what about our production servers? Why don't we move those to the cloud too? And it's like, really? You're not going to have your blinking lights in the other room? Are you going to be okay? And he just jumped in, and now it's great to see him. He goes out and presents to VM users groups on how to move your things to the cloud, which is, it's just a totally different approach. He made the conscious choice to learn and dig into this. The other gentleman decided he wanted to stay where he was.
So I think that's a really interesting and important point, because what you seem to be saying is that part of the key to becoming this lifelong learner is how you identify yourself, right? I mean, is that,
Right.
have you found yourself in that position doing that?
Well, I think that's exactly right. So I could have, in fact, for many years, how I saw myself was the long-haired hippie COBOL programmer sitting writing code for an IBM mainframe. And it was a friend of mine, and actually my wife, who suggested that you should go into management. You'd be really good at it. It's like, well, I don't want to play the politics, right? So but they drugged me kicking and screaming. And I found out by really kind of that emotional intelligence, looking at myself and understanding, yeah, I was kind of good at it. There were still some skills I needed to learn, so I once again dive into the textbooks and start taking some coursework, going to seminars, observing people around me, learn how to be a manager, learn how to be a supervisor, and then start to layer in, what does leadership look like on top of that? And it all started by identifying that this is really where I want to go, and these are some of the strengths that I have.
I think it's a nice segue, because I think, certainly you've read my book, I think, when
Yes.
one of the things that I'm a huge believer in is that we're in this time of tremendous change, and
Yes.
this idea of the identity that many people in IT have is in fact going to change, because the jobs that we used to do just aren't going to be there anymore. And I think it's very, very important. But I think, so as an executive, I guess my question is, have you taken some of these lessons that you've learned through your career, and how do you apply them to helping your teams embrace this idea of lifelong learning?
That's a difficult challenge, because a lot of times from the CIO role, or really any leadership role, you may have a vision of what the future is. Your book described it very well. And sometimes you have to translate that into what that means to the individual. And I go back to those two systems engineers, and I always wonder, had I spent more time one-on-one with that individual saying, this is what I think the future is bringing, and I think this is the future that I see you in, and help them see that, see themselves in the future, perhaps by coaching and helping them see that vision, it would have made a difference in that gentleman's decision. So I've really taken a very specific approach with my team now, we talk about the future a lot, and what it means to the changing role, from everything from a systems engineer to a software developer to a hardware technician, right? I mean, you're sitting here with an iPad that you can't afford to fix, because it's so inexpensive. So how can you afford to have a team of people whose job it is to fix hardware? They need to grow and change what they're doing, and take a more consultative approach with the end user about, how does all this stuff work on the iPad, on the laptop, on the cell phone? So how does it all work together? Not necessarily how does the hardware work. So it's a different world, a different mindset.
Jeff's story really resonated with me. Career and life journeys are not always nice and neat, but we always have a choice about what we learn and how we identify ourselves. He challenged us to make that choice consciously and deliberately, and to recognize where our own personal weaknesses might be, and to focus our learning in those areas. Then he told us that we must help our teams understand what's coming next, to help them on their own learning journeys. In the next episode, Jeff is going to share with us how all of this applies at a leadership and executive level, and how transparency is a key to learning growth. You're not going to want to miss it. Until then, I'm Charles Araujo, and together we can change the world of IT.